Good to be with you again for this third in our series on creation in the book of Genesis. Previously, we've asked a question about the genre of this part of the Bible, acknowledging that however we answer this question will ultimately determine how we understand what we're reading. Is this a scientific journal? Is it a history book? Is it a fictional story like a fable or a fairy tale? As we've read through the first chapter of Genesis, we've noted several poetic, artistic or stylistic devices. There's the 7-day structure responding to the beginning state of formless and empty, verse 2, with form and then filling. There's the repetition of phrases and the increasing complexity of the activity within each day. It's in this way that the text itself tells us how it's to be understood. This is not a step-by-step guide detailing how God created the universe. It's not technical in any ways that we can recognise or compare with our own frame of reference in the 21st century. How God did it all, except by his command, is not a question that concerns the text. So what kind of genre is it, and how do we understand it? I think it's most useful to understand Genesis 1 as a creation narrative, divinely inspired to convey the truth of God's purposes and relationship to humanity, to the environment, and to all of the other creatures as well. This category of creation narrative, it's useful because there were quite a few creation narratives circulating in the ancient Near East and in Egypt at about the same time that this text was written. So, for example, we know a fair bit about the Enuma Elish, a famous Babylonian text, or the Osiris story from ancient Egypt. And we do also in Australia know a little of our own Indigenous people's Dreamtime creation narratives. And so it seems that Genesis chapter 1, or perhaps even all the way through to chapter 11, is of this kind of literature with this kind of purpose, to explain the world as it is, where it's come from and how we got there, and where we fit in this world. So to be clear, it's God's inspired and authoritative account of things for the benefit of its original audience and for all of those that will follow, including us, but it's using a very familiar literary genre. So who wrote this Genesis creation narrative, and when did they write it? Well, traditionally, Moses is credited as the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, as it's called. Now, Moses wasn't there on days 1 through 6 of creation, nor was he in the Garden of Eden, or actually anywhere else in the book of Genesis. Instead, he's the collector and editor of the oral traditions of his people. Why is Moses writing down and codifying the traditions of the Hebrew people? Well, by the time of Moses, God's people have been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Even as they embark on their exodus, they think like Egyptians. They have an Egyptian worldview. They have little idea of God's promises to Abraham and his purposes in creation. And so, inspired and enabled by God, Moses collects, edits, and records the traditions of his people, to teach them and to train them to see the world God's way. This setting explains both the similarities and the differences between Genesis and the other creation narratives from the surrounding cultures and religions, all at about the same time. Although it uses a similar form, Genesis has some startling contrasts which provide a corrective and a rebuke to the Egyptian worldview. As we've seen, there's only one God. At that beginning point, the only actor, the only subject, the only being is God. He created the heavens and the earth from nothing. God didn't use any leftover bits of other things or the remains of other divine beings that he had defeated in battle. There is no subterfuge, there is no struggle, there is no conflict. God speaks and it is so. And this is, of course, a complete contrast to the warring Egyptian, Assyrian and Babylonian gods who are variously angry, arrogant, gullible and foolish. And so, in a sense, the creation narrative in Genesis is a corrective to help Israel see the world God's way rather than through the eyes of the Egyptian deities or the Babylonian pantheon. So I think this literature of creation narrative gives us a bit of a handle, a useful handle that helps us read Genesis 1. So let's just go back now over the chapter and notice the character of God who is revealed there with greater clarity than we might ever have had before, because it stands against this genre of creation narrative. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Who is God? At the beginning, he is already there, self-existent and all-powerful. Strangely, there is some kind of multiplicity within God, because right there in verse 2, the Spirit of God is distinguished from God in verse 1. Indeed, when God later creates human beings, he speaks to himself using the plural. Let us make mankind in our image. So God is not lonely, such that he needs to create other beings to talk with. Instead, the God who is relational within himself creates human beings in his own image. They are fundamentally relational, just like him. What else do we observe about God in this creation narrative? Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. God's power is so absolute, so infinite, that he creates light simply by speaking. Darkness seems to be the primordial state, but now without any apparent difficulty or exertion, God just calls forth light, and it is so. We notice this in the first chapter of Genesis, that God also names things as he creates them, night and day and sky and land and seas and so forth. The authority to name things stems from God having created them. Although later on Adam will be invited to name animals, perhaps exercising his image-bearing privilege. So many other creation narratives describe the earth and its creatures as being the result of some kind of divine or heavenly conflict, perhaps even the unintended consequence of a war between the gods. But here, God reigns supreme. His creation purpose is unchallenged and uncompromised. Reading on a little further, verses 6 through 8 describe a cosmology that seems a little strange to us. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning, the second day. So the premise here is that there is a flat earth with water under the earth and water above the dome of the sky, like a kind of a snow globe with air trapped inside it, and it's immersed in water. Now, this reflects an ancient understanding of earth and sky, which is clearly at odds with contemporary science. So this doesn't undermine the truthfulness of Genesis, of course, not a bit. The point is that God is sovereign even over the sky and the seas, and later on over the sun, moon and the stars. The actual arrangement of all is not what this creation narrative is trying to establish. It's really about the God who did it all, more than the geology or the astrophysics or the cosmology. Once again, we also notice the marking off of the days, this first day and then here in the second day. Well, as we've said, there's no sun, mind you, until the fourth day, so it's impossible to measure the 24 hours by the rotation of the earth in relation to the sun, because that's how long we think a day is. No, the attempt to overlay contemporary science over this ancient creation narrative makes no sense whatsoever. So we don't need to do that. This is more about God and what he reveals about himself in relation to his creation. And so let's read on. The third day, and God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. This is the first of 7 times that the adjective good is used of God's creative endeavours. Nothing is said in this sort of summary statement at the end of the first 2 days, but instead there's building crescendo of good and goodness through days 3 through 6, until at the end of the 6th day we learn that creation is very good. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 6th day. So what is this goodness of which God speaks? Whatever else it might mean, it must mean that it is fit for purpose. It is exactly as God intended it, acting as the setting for the completion of God's purposes in creation. His glory is displayed now, and ultimately this landscape will serve as the backdrop for the redemption of a people in Jesus Christ. It doesn't negate the possibility that evil might somehow find a foothold in it, but it does allow for the ultimate redemption of God's people. All this leads us to marvel at the wisdom of God in creation. Quite distinct from every other attempt to understand the nature and the purpose of the world in which we find ourselves, Genesis 1 puts God, unrivaled, in the centre. It is his world for his glory and purpose. Can I invite us all to make this the subject of our prayers now?